Here's how to make an EDM track completely from scratch inside of FL Studio. Let's start with the tempo. I'm using 127 beats per minute for my project. However, this can range anywhere from 120 to 140 BPM. The entire foundation of this track is built around the chord progression, so let's jump straight into that. Let's start by taking a key or a pad preset. Here I'm using the Ice Kings preset in Pigments, and also the Nidra preset. I'll be using the key of A sharp minor for this beat, so let's select this under View and Scale Highlighting. We'll go A sharp for the root note, and we'll change the scale to minor natural. Now we can see exactly what notes we can use in light grey, and the dark grey notes are outside of the scale, so we can't use these. Now I've simply created a 1-4-6 progression, which simply consists of the first, fourth, and sixth notes in the scale. Here you'll see that I've simply just shifted this down an octave. After adding the root note, we can skip a note, and add a note, and skip a note, and add a note in the scale to get the triad chord. This will give us all major or minor chords. There is one exception to this. The second chord in the scale is a diminished chord, but this usually never sounds good, so I almost always avoid using this in my chord progressions. I then duplicated this chord progression across over here, the only difference being that I pitched the C sharp down an octave. This is known as an inversion. Here's how our chord progression will now sound altogether. Now let's add a bass line to fill out the low end of the frequency spectrum, as this sounds like it's missing something. To do this, we'll simply just copy and paste the root notes of the chords across into a bass preset. I've decided to use the Growler Moog bass from Omnisphere. Note that I also decided to shift the D sharp down an octave, as I just prefer how this sounds. Moving notes up and down octaves will not affect your progressions melodically. Now here's how our chords and bass lines sound all together. To keep this intro from sounding bland, let's add an ARP or an ambience loop. I've copied the chord progression and used this preset from Omnisphere, Active Grains of Picked Glass. Here's how this sounds. Now you'll be able to hear the very subtle effect that this has on the track. Now the intro is done. So let's start working on the build up. We want to add some rhythm to the melody to make this feel like it's moving and progressing as we build up towards the drop. So again, let's copy our chord progression across and use an ARP or a sequence. Or we can copy this across and use a key preset and then change the rhythm of the chords. Here's how this sounds. The rhythm for this is really simple. It's simply just chopped up into half beats. We could have just played the melody like this. Now let's right click on the channel volume and create an automation clip. We can then adjust the automation so that the volume fades in. Let's also open up our mixer, go to the master track, open up a Fruity Parametric EQ2, browse the presets and select either the 20Hz and 18kHz cut or the 30Hz and 18kHz cut. We can then right click on the frequency band and click Create Automation Clip. Here we can slowly increase the cutoff of the high pass filter to take out the lows and bring them back just before we transition into the next section. Here's how the transition sounds. I've also pulled up the EQ so you can see how this works in real time. We can now move on to the last 8 bars of the build-up, which will play all the way up until the drop. For this, we'll need to create some tension with drums, and also begin to fade our lead melody into the drop. I've taken this build-up loop from Splice. But you can easily create this yourself by playing a repetitive clap pattern and adding some white noise transition effects. I've also added this to a mixer track and added a saturator. I've then automated the drive of the saturator to add some energy to this. For the lead, let's start working on our melody. I've created my own lead in Serum, which consists of a low sub, an Atari wave, and a saw wave with 5 voices and a small amount of detune. The saw wave is pitched up 7 semitones to add harmonics. Essentially, this is playing a power chord. This is the lead melody that I created. Basically, just choose any notes in the scale and play around with notes until you find something that works with the chord progression. Let's now assign this to a mixer track and add a fruity parametric EQ too. We're then going to automate the high pass filter, like we did on the master track earlier, to fade this into the drop. For effects, I added some saturation, and I added the portal preset that I automate, just to give this some variation. Let's also cut the bass line and the pads here. We can then add a short drum fill just before the drop. Here's how the build-up sounds all together. I've added the fruity parametric EQ2 for the lead, so that you can see how this works. Now it's time for the drop. Drum patterns in EDM, or more specifically house, are super simple. It's a 4 on the floor kick, which simply means that a kick drum is played every 4 steps, or every beat. There's then an offbeat open hat, and a clap that plays every 2 beats. So rather than drawing in the same pattern every time I create a track, I just prefer to use a pre-made loop. Now let's add a bass line. Again, for our bass line, we'll be following the root notes of the chords. We'll just chop this bass line up to add to the rhythm. We'll also assign this to a mixer track and add a kickstart for sidechain. Essentially, this ducks the volume of the bass when the kick hits, so that the frequencies don't clash and make our mix sound muddy. This will give it a form of pulsating effect. I've also added a saturation and a fruity parametric EQ2 to cut the highs and subs from the bass to allow room for the lead and also the sub bass, which we're going to add now. We'll copy the exact same pattern for the sub bass, but we'll use a deeper sounding sine wave. Here I've used the 3x oscillators and dropped the pitch down by 24 semitones. For this we'll add the same effects, a saturation and also an EQ, but this time we're cutting out the bass frequencies, which are above 100 Hz. Then of course we'll add the kickstart to sidechain this. You usually can't hear these sub frequencies, but you'll feel them if you're wearing headphones or if you're at a club or event. Together, here's how the bass line sounds. And with the drums. Now let's also add a crash or impact on the drop. Now let's add our chords and our lead back in. Finally, let's chop the drums out at the end of the 8-bar loop and add drum fills in for variation. Here's how this sounds with context. Now that the track is pretty much finished, we can duplicate this entire intro, build up, and hook section across. As you can see, this section here and this section here are pretty identical. All we need now is a vocal. I've taken this vocal from Splice,
I could put some words to a melody.
And I've also chopped this up for the build up section. I've then added portal presets to add delay and reverb automations as the vocal builds up towards the drop. Here's how this sounds in isolation. And now our track is finished. All we need to do is mix the volume levels and master the track. I've used this Ozone 11. If you want to listen to the full version of the track, I've attached a link to all streaming services in the description of this video. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video tomorrow.